Today is Friday, September 15th, 2023. Two very tragic cases.
We're following breaking news out of Michigan, where a jury has just cleared three men charged in the plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
What is your verdict?
When that verdict was read, there were gasps in the courtroom, tears and hugging among the acquitted defendants. That was just about 2 hours ago. It is the last trial related to the 2020 scheme to kidnap Governor Whitmer. 9 other men were convicted in prior cases. As of today, a total of 5 have been cleared. NBC's Antonia Hilton has been following the developments for us. I'm also joined by civil rights attorney and former prosecutor David Henderson, who is an MSNBC legal analyst. Antonia, good to see you. What charges did these guys face? And what do we know about the evidence? Was it a complete shock that they were cleared here?
Well, Chris, they were accused of providing material support for terrorist acts as part of this broader plot that you mentioned. So back in 2020, this group, the Wolverine Watchmen, a sprawling organization and militia group associated with right-wing movements and political ideologies, they were accused by authorities of planning to kidnap the governor. And these specific men who were acquitted today, these 3 men, they were on the sort of outskirts of the plan, so not the central actors here. So in that sense, it's not as much of a surprise, although what they were accused of doing was casing Governor Whitmer's property, of taking part in some militia drills. What they argued, though, is that they weren't aware of the full scope of the plot or the real purpose of the plot until much later. And throughout all the trials we've seen in this case, we've seen defense attorneys also bring forth an interesting argument that the FBI has planted inappropriate informants and at times made mistakes in the process. And in some ways, they allege even pushed the men involved in this to commit the crime themselves. And so that's some of what has complicated the narrative here. But as you mentioned, 9 people already either pled guilty or were convicted. And these 3 now make it a total of 5 who are acquitted and not guilty.
Let me ask this question. Can they be charged again? Yeah. How? Oh, federally, right? They may be able to be charged federally. Remember, 2 separate sovereigns, state and federal.
David, given the evidence in total, and obviously Antonia just gave us a pretty great lay of the land, what's your reaction to the acquittals?
Chris, I'm not shocked. And the reason I say that is because historically, in my experience, and I've tried somewhere between 70 and 80 cases, it's really hard to get a jury to convict if the person on trial isn't directly connectable to the harm or was not in the room when it happened. I think part of the reason why this shocks our sensibilities is because we see so many cases in the news that are directly related to people supporting wrongful activity, conspiracy charges, like the RICO charges coming out of Georgia, where these men would definitely be guilty underneath those laws. But when you actually present the cases to a jury, what they value goes a long way in terms of determining who they're actually going to convict. And in that regard, some of the arguments that were offered, like them being angry about the government, angry at police, and the jury discounting those, is surprising in this context.
Antonia Hilton, thank you so much. Come back on when your new book comes out, will you? And David, you're going to stick with me because there's another big legal case that we're watching just about half an hour from now in Memphis, Tennessee. At least 3 of the 5 former police officers who are charged in the death of Tyre Nichols are expected to appear in court. State prosecutors want to try all of the ex-cops together, but today at least 3 of
Some of the media thought that because they're African-American police that members of the different communities would treat them differently. No, wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter what you look like. Black, white, red, yellow, green, purple. Wrong is wrong. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and happiness, period. Equally, equitably, everyone, everywhere, every place, every country on this planet known as Earth.
Them are expected to ask for separate trials. So, David, what's the argument for separating defendants? Typically, I mean, we're just seeing this, but in a much more sprawling RICO case, right? But what is a compelling reason to separate defendants in a case like that?
Chris, in a nutshell, the argument is my guy wasn't that involved. And it's hard to say that in a case here where officers are accused of beating a young man to death as a mob, but that's what they're trying to do. What you have to ask yourself is, okay, look, Is it possible to try one of them without telling the story of everybody else who's directly involved? The only individual I've seen who makes a clear argument along those lines is defendant Miller. He's like, listen, I wasn't at the traffic stop, therefore my circumstances are different. But really, you can't separate out what he did from what everybody else did that contributed to Tyree's death.
And separate from the state's case, David, this week a grand jury indicted the ex-officers on federal charges of excessive force, deliberate indifference, and witness tampering. Is there...
Now, to answer my other question I asked earlier about the other case, can they also be brought up on other charges? Sure, if they violated federal law, right? And that's what's happening here. So this group is on state charges as well as federal charges, two separate sovereigns.
a case between the two of these that take precedence? Does one case impact the other? How does this work?
It remains to be determined, Chris. It's really up to the prosecutors, but we can look at prior cases and how the feds dealt with defendants in this context. And I think the most notable example is Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd. He went to trial first in Minnesota, and after he was convicted in Minnesota, he basically cut a deal for federal charges in order to go and serve the same amount of time. We saw a similar trend with the McMichaels, who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, even though they weren't police officers. And therefore, I'd expect the exact same thing to happen here. The officers face prosecution in Tennessee, and then the feds come around and either offer them the opportunity to make a deal or they face a second trial. And the reason I speak so conclusively is because the evidence is so strong against them here. Worst case scenario for the prosecutors, they lose in Tennessee and federal authorities get a second bite at the apple in federal court, where the stakes for these officers are even higher because they can get up to life in federal court, whereas they're facing 15 to 60 in state court.
David Henderson, always good to have you on the show. Thank you. Large and dangerous, the warning from forecasters about Hurricane Lee as it takes aim at coastal New England. We'll have a live report from Maine on how communities are preparing. Plus, NBC's Bill Cairns with a live weekend forecast. You're watching Chris Jansing Reports, only on MSNBC.
Friday, September 15, 2023.